Hey guys, this video is for educational purposes only. Please do not break the law. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today I have a very special guest, Mr. Carlos Martinez from LegalSolutionsOfNewMexico.com. Today I want to do something a little bit different and actually talk about what the process is like for getting a cannabis license. So this is going to be the start of an ongoing series we have here for each of the states where growing is legal. And today we're starting off with Carlos from Legal Solutions of New Mexico. And I'm really grateful that Carlos, you gave us a shot to give us a chance to talk to you and have you hopefully help people who are looking to get a cannabis license in New Mexico that are just kind of confused by the entire process. I think it's not the easiest thing to dive into to learn. So I'm really excited to talk to you and to learn all about it.
Awesome. Good morning, James. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. And like I said, I'm very excited to talk to you. This is going to be educational for me, and I think it's going to be educational for a lot of people that are just coming in.
Fantastic, man. Yeah, I hope I can answer some questions and maybe clarify some things on, getting a license here in the state of New Mexico. So
Cool. So let's just go ahead and start off with some of the basic questions about getting that license. So let's say you're just getting started off in New Mexico and you're not totally sure about what type of licenses there are or which one you should get. So let's just start off with a simple question. What type of licenses are there, and which ones should someone potentially consider?
So there's a couple different licenses. You can be a grower, you can be a manufacturer, you can be a dispensary owner, you can have an on-site consumption license attached to a dispensary. You could also be a courier, allowing at-home deliveries to adults 21 and over or those participating in the medical program, as well as a research and development license and a testing laboratory license. So there's a couple different licenses that are available here in the state.
Okay, cool. And so for growers in particular, it sounds like maybe it would be the research and development and what were the other ones?
So in addition to the research and development and the growers licenses, there's the dispensary license, the manufacturing license, and then attached to a retail license, you could also have an on-site consumption license where you can actually consume cannabis products on-site. And then the courier license allows deliveries to adults 21 and over or those participating in the medical program.
Okay, got it. So let's say I'm kind of new to the space and I don't know much right now. But I know that I want to start growing cannabis, and I know that I want to eventually potentially start selling the cannabis that I grow. So which licenses should I look at?
So if you're going to be a grower, it really depends on what your business plan is and the size of the farm that you're going to operate, right? Here in the state of New Mexico, there's two different types of licenses. There's a larger scale production license, allowing growers to grow anywhere from 201 plants all the way up to 16,000 mature female plants. Likewise, there's a micro business grower's license, and that caps the amount of mature female plants to 200 and below. So there's two different types of licenses that are available for growers here in the state of New Mexico.
Okay, cool. So it seems like there's quite a few options there. So if you're a smaller grower just getting started off, you can grow up to potentially 200 plants with that smaller license. And then once you're ready to really expand, you can go up to all the way up to 16,000 plants, which should hopefully be enough for a while. So yeah, cool. So what are the steps involved in applying for some of these growers licenses?
The growers licenses, there's a couple different things, I guess. You can separate it into the actual license application and then the business setup prior to the application process. Deciding what business entity you want to start in order to own and operate the license would probably be the first decision. Popular ones are the C Corps, the S Corps, a corporate entity, or a limited liability company. Lesser known and lesser used are limited partnerships, general partnerships, and joint ventures. But nonetheless, setting that up at the very beginning will be your priority. On top of that, if you do have partners or if you have multiple owners, making sure that you have your operating agreement and your bylaws drafted at the outset to prevent any future issues down the line when business partners come to disagreements with how the business should go. On top of that, you would go ahead and secure your state and tax ID numbers in order to be able to pay taxes. And then you can really start focusing on location here in the state. So New Mexico is a desert state. If you are going to be a grower, it's very important to be able to have access to water because that is one of the requirements here in the state of New Mexico in order to be licensed as either type of grower, whether it's a micro grow or a larger scale grow operation. You have to have water rights of some type. So deciding where you're able to grow would probably be another priority that you would like to undertake, especially if you're going to be investing a large amount of capital in making your grow operation, building it and growing it throughout the state. On top of that, a good look at the statutes to make sure that we know what rules we're operating under, to make sure we know what the Cannabis Control Division is going to require for the requirements. And then you can start putting your application together, which is, requires a couple different things, right? So they do require that you identify whoever the owners are. And to be an owner, you have to be a 10% or above financial owner or have an equity stake in the business. At that point, you do have to be disclosed on the application. They want to make sure that you have your standard operating procedures, making sure that you have your policies, employee policies, security policies, things of that nature. On top of that, New Mexico requires a social equity and economic diversity plan. So that has to be drafted. It takes into account multiple factors, minority status, whether it's female owned, veteran owned, and that's put in and taken into account when applying for not only the initial license, but renewal of a license or increasing or decreasing the plants count that's allowed pursuant to your license. So once those are all put together, you submit that to the state of New Mexico to make sure that you get your state license, and then you will be able to start putting together the requirements for your local city license or city ordinance license for the cannabis in each either city or county in the state of New Mexico. They each have their individual rules, but those also must be complied with. And then lastly, you have to get your business license, make sure that your building is up to operating code, and then you can get ready to start your operation. So there's a long list of items that need to be completed prior to opening your doors.
Great. That's really an amazing piece of information there. So it's definitely, there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to getting your license there. So my first question based off that is it the exact same requirements for that smaller grow, that micro grow, as well as the larger grow?
For the production, for the growers' licenses, they do require pretty much the same things. The main difference in these types of licenses, I guess, would be the price and cost. If you're going to be a micro producer, the cost of that license is $1,000 per premises with an initial $2,500 licensing fee. So that versus the larger scale producer license, which starts at $2,500 with a $1,000 premises fee, and then each plant you grow for commercial purposes is going to carry with it a $5 fee on top of that. So that total fee is going to be due at the time of application. So that'll vary as to what you ultimately pay with the larger scale producer license. But in terms of the requirements, you have to have your cultivation plans. You have to be able to identify electricity use. You have to identify your water source. So there's a lot of similar requirements. The premises diagram obviously will differ due to the size required for the size of the operation, but other than that, they're relatively similar.
Okay, so my next question is, because I know some states have limits on the amount of licenses they allow. So are there any limits to the amount of licenses in New Mexico?
There are no limits to the amount of licensed premises. So you can get one production license and you can have multiple premises throughout the state. You can have one dispensary license and then you have multiple locations throughout the state. So in that respect, there is no limit. The limits are the resources for the production. So the water is a pretty big limit on the actual licensing application itself. But in terms of statutory or rules, there are no limits as to how many they will grant, so long as you have, a premises that passes the regulations and you have an application that's put together pursuant to the state rules.
Okay, great. So cool. That's some awesome information so far. So typically when you put in your license application, how long does it take to hear back?
So statutorily, they have 90-day turnaround time. Now that varies depending upon, resources as to how many people are actually available to review applications. If it's a testing lab application, it has to go to a secondary testing or review source, the scientific laboratory division here in the state. So that kind of has to go through two different departments to get back. But the timeline is 90 days. I've seen it range anywhere and as quick as 7 days, but I've seen it take as long as 140 to 150 days. So there's a big balance and variance as to when they can actually turn one of those applications around.
Cool. And so let's say we're at a point where we finally got our license. We're growing now. And how often are we subject to inspections? And on top of that, are there penalties for non-compliance with state regulations?
Yes, and there is no limit or minimum amount of inspections. The inspections do come through the licensing process and the fact that your building, your location has to pass building codes and has to pass zoning codes. But in terms of like an audit to ensure that your operations are complying with rules and regulations, it varies. It is not set, but they do have the opportunity to come produce and conduct on-site inspections the day of. Due to that variable, you always have to be in compliance. You always have to have your proper policies and procedures on site to ensure that you can hand those over to an auditor once that time comes. Now, what does it entail? It entails the state or state representative showing up, identifying themselves with a badge or some sort of identification. Then they can go ahead and look around the store. They can look at your products. They can look at your labels. They can look at your inventory lists. They can look at your premises site. They can look at your security footage. So they can pretty much look within a reasonable amount of time and space. They can go ahead and take a look at your entire operation on the day of. If they do find violations, normally the proper course of action or the course of action that the state would take is they will issue a letter identifying, where the violations were or whether your inspection passed. They do give you some sort of leeway to go ahead and to cure any listed items on their inspection list, in which you can go ahead and fix, let's say, a labeling issue, a surveillance issue, an entry door issue, whatever the case may be. Submit that evidence back to the state, and then they will go ahead and clear out that letter, and you can continue your operations. If they do find violations that have not been rectified to their approval, they will then take the next step and then file some sort of a notice of contemplated action. It's an administrative proceeding, much like a court procedure. A lot less rules and rules of evidence apply. However, the issue will go to a hearing officer, in which point, they will have a trial of sorts to determine whether or not this particular license will be suspended, revoked, fines issued, et cetera, et cetera. So it really depends on the violation, the degree of the violation, the severity of it, and then really what can happen through that administrative process to determine whether the business operator will be able to continue operations or whether they will be revoked and then subject to, other fines.
Cool. So it does seem like, if you do maybe mess up on the regulations a bit, there is some leeway there to fix the situation. So that's good to know, and it's good to know that New Mexico is like that. So my next questions are about financial and tax considerations. So what are the tax implications for cannabis growers in New Mexico? And are there any specific tax breaks or incentives available for cannabis businesses?
Right now, currently tax incentives, no. Tax issues that affect not only the growers, but the industry as a whole include, what's referred to as Section 280E. And that's a section in the Internal Revenue Code which prohibits any cannabis business in the industry, whether you're a grower, a dispensary, courier, whatever, from deducting business expenses, from deducting ordinary necessary business expenses that other businesses are otherwise eligible to deduct when calculating taxes. So that essentially means that the industry as a whole are paying taxes on a larger, more inflated revenue number versus, a normal, quote unquote, normal business being able to deduct payroll, utilities, and then being taxed on that particular number. They're effectively paying a much higher tax just because of that 280E prohibition. So that is prohibitive for a lot of businesses that don't tax plan around that, right? Recently, and I'm sure you've looked into it, that they've proposed to reschedule cannabis. And 280E is important because it only prohibits anything that deals in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substances, right? And cannabis federally is listed as a Schedule 1 substance. The proposed rescheduling would put it down from 1 to 3, which would obviously take it out of that 280E prohibition, which would allow them to have taxes. However, it'll still remain federally illegal, and it'll basically still be in the same legal position between the states as it is right now. So there's a lot of up in the air as to how that's going to play out. But in the tax aspect, I think that's going to be super beneficial if it gets finalized.
Cool, and I'm glad you actually brought that up because I wanted to get your input on that. What are your thoughts on the new reclassification, and how do you think that's going to impact the industry?
I mean, huge step in the right direction, especially if you've done your research on the cannabis industry and coming from reefer madness, total prohibition, outright lies about the substance, to basically a very viable economy producing billions of dollars. I think it's a great step in the right direction. It's huge in the right direction. Does it go far enough? I think that's the problem. If it's still at odds with the state laws, you still have, the federal state dynamic as to competing rules. It's still federally illegal, Schedule 3 substances generally require prescriptions. So there's no real clear understanding as to whether now for a dispenser you're going to have to, get a prescription, which will kind of put it back into just the medical sense, which is confusing. Or are they going to let the states, allow them to run their own programs pursuant to their rules? So that's not clear. The positive thing, like I mentioned, is the tax will go away, the cost prohibitive tax. But ultimately, I think if they let the states regulate it, like, tobacco and alcohol, each state will be able to provide, whatever services they deem acceptable. Here, recreational and medical, Texas prefers not to have, necessarily either. I think they have a medical program, but it's very limited. So, but that, alcohol, tobacco, the way that's regulated, I think the states, if they regulate that, you'll take away those issues, and that'll be the best case scenario. In what it's done right now, I think it's a good step in the right direction, but it's probably not enough to appease everybody's concerns.
Cool. Well, a step in the right direction is a step in the right direction, so can't complain about that. Carlos, I wanted to ask you, just like I said earlier, there's a lot of moving parts within the cannabis license acquisition process. So how does your firm help with this? Can you guys do like a full process help with this? What can you guys do to help someone who's coming in and looking for it? And do you guys help with all the different license types?
So yeah, we're a law firm that can help any, it's a full service law firm for the licensing aspect of it, beginning really with the business planning. That really needs to be pretty accurate and taken care of at the outset prior to, moving forward through the process. But if, let's say, you have a bunch of entrepreneurs that just need consulting, we can do that. Or if you have a bunch of entrepreneurs that say, hey, we want to do this business, but we need you to hold our hand essentially to take us all the way to the end, we can also do that. On top of that, we also do litigation. So meaning we go to court, we represent clients, we pursue remedies if we're having issues. A lot of our litigation, takes place at the administrative level. So at zoning, if there's a location that's, perfect, it's a very great asset. We need to find out if it's zoned correctly, number one. If it's not, can we get a conditional use permit? And do we have to go, in front of a council? We can help with that. Securing the water rights is a pretty big one for the growers. And the water rights, sometimes it does come down to litigation. Sometimes it comes down to, reading, deeds and titles. But whatever the case may be, we're able to, assist in that aspect as well. But all the way through, getting business licenses, tax planning, to ensure that we can minimize the effects of 280E, so you can actually run your business, reinvest in your business and be able to take as many tax deductions that are properly allowed. We're also able to help, any sort of expansion, opportunities, whether here in the state of New Mexico. We're also operating right now in the state of Minnesota, which is getting their program, started and growing. Or, if you're looking to sell a business that you've created and you want to, you have an exit strategy, we can also help with the sale of a business. Mergers and acquisitions, kind of related to the same thing, we're able to do and assist with that. But there's a lot of different things, in addition to just the business aspect and litigation, general consulting, general counsel, having something, a reference to, hey, we have a question, or this legislation changed, what does it mean? Things of that nature. We provide a number of services.
Awesome. And I highly recommend anybody who's listening to this to reach out to Carlos. Like I said, this is not an easy process. If anything, just for consulting, he's obviously extremely knowledgeable on the subject. So, and I'm extremely appreciative of him for joining the call to help educate whoever is listening. So, Carlos, before we finish off, I just want to ask you one last question. For anybody listening who's potentially thinking about getting started in New Mexico, what is the current landscape like? Is it a good industry still to get into? What are your thoughts on how the industry looks? Is it growing? Just curious on your thoughts on that.
The landscape is shifting, let's say that. I think it may be because of the lack of a cap on licenses. It's becoming saturated, not necessarily like Oregon, but it is becoming saturated to a point. That's number one. Number two, there are also businesses that are now realizing that this isn't a backyard grow anymore. 200 plant operation is out of my league. I have to get out of the game. So a lot of businesses like that may be shutting down. Three, there's been some litigation due to the fact they didn't properly plan at the outset. So people who don't have an operating agreement, they're now finding themselves disagreeing as to, hey, let's sell the business, or hey, let's grow the business, or let's get rid of a partner. That litigation is kind of starting to hit pretty hard. But overall, as a state, I think the growth of the production industry is going to be limited to the resources that we have available to us, right? It's a desert state, and if we run out of water, then we're not, going to be able to have any of those licenses. I foresee those probably being capped off, or at least being discussed very heavily as to whether they're going to cap that off. But in terms of overall expansion, like I mentioned before, Minnesota is getting their program up and running. They're in the rulemaking process right now. And there's a number of states throughout, the USA that have either pending legislation, pending votes. The state of Virginia actually had an actual schematic proposed to the governor ready to go, and they refused to sign off on that. So they vetoed that. So their program is kind of in a state of flux. But overall growth of the industry, I think it's going up. Internationally, I believe, and I want to say Germany or somewhere in Europe, they just legalized or allowed recreational. So I think there is momentum. Currently, as it stands, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So there's a lot of interest with big pharma as well, and bigger, financial institutions. They're really watching the rescheduling of 280E. But it's exciting overall. It's a very exciting industry.
Cool. And can you give 3 pieces of advice for a grower looking to get started in New Mexico, trying to compete with some of these big boys?
3 pieces of advice, I guess. Number 1 is ensure you have a very good understanding of what the business is going to be, right? A business plan. Sit down with all of the members that you have, all of the owners. If you don't have those and you're a solo entrepreneur, make sure you put a business plan together. If not to raise money, specifically just to keep yourself on track. What's the business going to be? What is my growth? What do I want to do? What's my exit strategy? Get that all set up, get the legal entity, and get your operating agreement, taken care of. That's number 1. Number 2, really understand either how to operate a commercial farm, what's required and what's the scope, of work that's required to operate a 200 plant farm versus a 16,000 plant farm. And if you don't have that particular knowledge, make sure you have somebody that has the actual knowledge. Make sure you do the due diligence on them, because there's a lot of people in the industry that claim to be experts and then come to find out they grew a couple plants in their house and now they're out of their league growing 50 plants. Much less 200 plants. So make sure you have a good group of trusted advisors, I guess, would be number 2. And then number 3, be ready for change. Be ready for change almost on a daily basis. Be ready for the laws to move around. Be ready for local ordinances to move around. Be ready for legislation to pop up. Because if you're not ready to adapt at a relatively rapid pace, especially in a business aspect, you're going to find yourself behind and ultimately in a hole that you can't dig yourself out of.
Awesome information. Carlos, I really appreciate you hopping on this call with me. Just one more time, shout out to Legal Solutions of New Mexico. If you guys are looking to basically do anything in the cannabis business, reach out to Carlos over here. And after you guys get your license, go ahead and reach out to greenthumbdepot.com. We can definitely help you guys outfit your grow. We've got pretty much every product there is, and we definitely have the best prices on the market. So shout out to Carlos. Again, Carlos, thank you so much.
Absolutely, James. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, man.
All right. Take care.